Some people carry the weight of the world in silence. They smile when they're breaking. They nod when they're drowning. They say, "I'm fine," with a conviction that almost makes it true. These are the people who never ask for help, not because they don't need it, but because somewhere along the way they learned that needing was dangerous, that vulnerability was weakness, that to reach out was to burden, to fail, to prove they were not enough. And so they became fortresses, self-reliant, unshakable, alone. But beneath the armor, there is exhaustion, a quiet plea that never finds words, a longing to be seen without having to say a single thing.
They move through the world like they need nothing from it. There is a certain grace in the way they carry themselves, shoulders back, voice steady, always composed. They're the ones people turn to when things fall apart. The reliable one, the strong one, the one who never complains, never falters, never asks. And in a world that celebrates self-sufficiency, they have become its perfect ambassadors, masters of managing alone. But independence, when worn too tightly, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a performance, a well-rehearsed role they no longer remember auditioning for. They have learned to anticipate needs before they arise, to solve problems before anyone notices there was one, to preemptively close doors before anyone can see inside. They do not wait to be disappointed. They do not risk being let down. They simply do not ask. And so they become islands. There is something deeply lonely about always being the strong one, because strength, when it has no place to rest, becomes a kind of prison. They hold themselves together so well that no one thinks to check if they're falling apart. They solve everyone else's problems with such ease that it never occurs to anyone they might have their own. And slowly, quietly, they begin to believe the story they've been telling, that they don't need help, that they are fine, that this is just who they are. But beneath the surface, something else is happening. The fortress they've built, brick by brick, boundary by boundary, was meant to protect them. And perhaps once it did. Perhaps there was a time when closing off made sense, when independence was the only safe option. But now the walls that kept danger out also keep connection at bay. The very thing that made them strong has made them unreachable. They notice it in small ways. The friend who stops offering because they've been turned down too many times. The partner who learns not to ask how they're really doing because the answer is always the same. The colleague who assumes they have it all figured out and never thinks to check in. And each time, the isolation deepens, not because people don't care, but because the mask is so convincing that no one sees past it. And the tragic irony is this: they are exhausted. Exhausted from holding it all, from being everyone's rock while crumbling inside, from pretending that carrying the world alone is sustainable, manageable, even preferable. But to admit exhaustion would be to admit need. And to admit need would be to shatter the entire identity they've spent years constructing. So they keep going. They keep smiling through the weight, keep saying, "I've got it," when their hands are already full, keep brushing off concern with practiced ease. And the more they do it, the more natural it becomes, until independence stops being a choice and starts being the only way they know how to exist. But here is what they rarely allow themselves to see. Independence is not the same as strength, and needing help is not the same as weakness. There is a difference between being self-reliant and being unable to rely on anyone, between being capable and being unwilling to be vulnerable, between choosing solitude and being terrified of connection. And somewhere along the way, the line between these things blurred. They became so good at not needing that they forgot how to want, so skilled at self-sufficiency that they lost the language of asking, so protective of their autonomy that they built a life where no one could ever get close enough to see them struggle. And now they are tired. Tired of the mask, tired of the fortress, tired of being strong in a way that leaves no room for softness. But they don't know how to stop. because to stop would mean admitting that all this time they were not as okay as they seemed, that the strength was sometimes just survival, that the independence was sometimes just fear wearing a different name. So they continue, day after day, carrying what they carry, smiling when they need to, nodding when asked if they're fine, and the world sees what they want it to see. Someone who has it all together, someone who never needs help. But late at night, when the performance ends and the audience is gone, there is a quiet truth they cannot ignore.
No one is born believing they must carry everything alone. Children reach instinctively. They cry when they're hurt, call out when they're scared, extend their arms when they need to be held. Dependence is their first language. Trust is their default setting. They do not yet know that asking can be dangerous, that needing can be met with silence, that vulnerability can be weaponized. But then something happens. Perhaps it was a parent who was too tired, too overwhelmed, too absent to respond. A caregiver whose love came with conditions. Be good, be quiet, be easy. A household where problems were met with irritation rather than comfort, where asking for help was treated as inconvenience, where emotional needs were dismissed as dramatics. And so, the child learned, my needs are too much. My feelings are a burden. If I want to be loved, I must need less. Or perhaps it was subtler than that. Perhaps it was watching a mother carry the weight of everything without complaint, seeing a father who never admitted struggle, never showed weakness, never asked for support. And the child absorbed the lesson without anyone speaking it aloud. Strength means silence. Competence means independence. To ask is to admit you are not enough. Or maybe the lesson came later, a betrayal that shattered trust. A moment when they reached out and no one was there. A time they asked for help and were met with judgment, mockery, or indifference. A friend who used their vulnerability against them. A partner who saw their need as weakness. A world that punished softness and rewarded stoicism. And so they adapted. They stopped asking, stopped reaching, stopped believing that help would come even if they did. They became their own solution, their own support system, their own rescue. And in doing so, they survived. But survival, when it becomes the only strategy, leaves scars that do not show on the surface. Because here is what happens when a child learns that asking is unsafe. They do not simply stop asking. They internalize the belief that their needs are inherently problematic, that to need is to be flawed, that dependency is not a natural human state, but a personal failure. They begin to see themselves through the lens of that early rejection. They become hyper-competent, determined to prove they can manage alone. They develop an acute sensitivity to being a burden, constantly scanning for signs that they are asking too much, taking up too much space, needing too much care. They preemptively withdraw before anyone has the chance to let them down. And they wear their independence like armor, never realizing it was forged in pain. But the roots go even deeper. Psychologists speak of attachment styles, the patterns formed in early relationships that shape how we connect throughout life. Those who never ask for help often carry what is called an avoidant attachment. As children, their bids for comfort were inconsistently met or actively discouraged, and so they learned to suppress their needs, to self-soothe, to expect nothing from others. They became emotionally self-sufficient, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And this pattern does not simply disappear with age. It follows them into friendships where they are always the giver, never the receiver. Into romantic relationships where they struggle to lean on their partner, where intimacy feels terrifying because it requires admitting need. Into workplaces where they take on more than they can handle rather than ask for support. Into every corner of their life, shaping how they move through the world. But here is the quiet tragedy. The independence they developed as protection has become a prison. What once kept them safe now keeps them isolated. The walls they built to avoid rejection now prevent connection. The self-reliance that helped them survive childhood now suffocates them in adulthood.
Because the world has changed, but the pattern has not. The people around them are not the ones who taught them that asking was dangerous, but they cannot see that. The old wound still dictates the present response. And so, they continue to carry everything alone. Not because they are exceptionally strong, but because they are still that child who learned that needing meant being too much, that asking meant being a burden, that the only way to be safe was to need nothing from anyone.
The brain does not distinguish between emotional wounds and physical ones. When a child reaches out and no one responds, when they cry and are met with irritation, when they learn that their needs will not be met, the brain does not simply process this as disappointment. It processes it as danger, as threat, as something to be avoided at all costs. And so it adapts. It builds pathways designed to protect, to prevent that pain from happening again. This is not conscious. This is survival. Neuroscientists have mapped the way early relational experiences shape the developing brain. In those first years of life, the neural circuits responsible for trust, connection, and emotional regulation are being formed. And they are formed in response to the environment. A child whose needs are consistently met develops a nervous system that expects safety, that trusts others will respond, that feels comfortable reaching out. But a child whose needs are ignored, dismissed, or met with inconsistency develops something else entirely. They develop a hypervigilant nervous system, one that is always scanning for signs of rejection, one that interprets asking for help as a potential threat, one that feels safer in isolation than in connection. And this is not a choice. This is the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do, adapting to survive in the environment it found itself in. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, becomes particularly sensitive in those who learned early that dependency was dangerous. When they even think about asking for help, the amygdala activates. It sends signals of alarm. It floods the body with cortisol and adrenaline. It triggers the same physiological response as if they were facing a genuine threat. And so asking for help does not feel like a neutral act. It feels terrifying. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational thought and emotional regulation, struggles to override this response. Because the fear is not logical, it is not based on present reality. It is an echo from the past, a neural pathway carved so deeply that it has become automatic. And this is why simply telling someone to just ask for help rarely works. Because they are not choosing independence out of stubbornness or pride. They are responding to a nervous system that has been conditioned to perceive asking as unsafe. Their brain is doing exactly what it was trained to do: protect them from the pain of unmet needs, from the vulnerability of dependence, from the threat of rejection. Psychologists call this an avoidant attachment style, and it has a clear neurological signature. Studies using brain imaging have shown that people with avoidant attachment show reduced activity in the areas associated with trust and social connection. When they see images of people in distress, their mirror neurons, the neurons that allow us to empathize and feel what others feel, are less active. Not because they lack empathy, but because their brain has learned to suppress emotional responsiveness as a form of protection. They have become, quite literally, neurologically wired for independence. And the pattern reinforces itself over time. Each time they choose not to ask, the neural pathway strengthens. Each time they manage alone, the brain receives confirmation. See, you do not need anyone. Each time they avoid vulnerability, the amygdala learns that isolation is safer than connection.
And so the cycle continues, not because they want it to, but because the brain is simply following the blueprint it was given. But there is more happening beneath the surface. The stress of chronic self-reliance takes a profound toll on the body. When someone carries everything alone, when they suppress their needs and push through exhaustion, the nervous system remains in a constant state of activation. The body never fully relaxes. Cortisol levels stay elevated. The immune system weakens. Sleep becomes disrupted. And over time, this chronic stress manifests as physical symptoms: headaches, digestive issues, chronic pain, autoimmune conditions. The body, in its quiet wisdom, is trying to send a message: you cannot keep doing this alone. But the brain, still operating from old programming, interprets these symptoms as something to be managed independently. They push through the fatigue. They ignore the signals. They add "figure out what's wrong with me" to the list of things they must handle by themselves. And the cycle deepens. Researchers have also found that people who struggle to ask for help often have an overactive default mode network, the part of the brain responsible for self-referential thinking. They spend a disproportionate amount of time analyzing their own thoughts, monitoring their own performance, critiquing their own responses. They live inside their own minds, constantly assessing whether they are being too much, asking too much, needing too much.
There are two voices inside them, always at war. One says, "You are strong, you can handle this, you always have." The other whispers, "You are drowning, you need help, you cannot keep going like this." And they live in the space between these voices, torn between the identity they have built and the truth they cannot ignore. This is the paradox of those who never ask for help. They are strong, genuinely, deeply strong. They have carried what others could not. They have survived what would have broken someone else. They have built lives, careers, relationships on the foundation of their own resilience. And that strength is real. It is not a lie. It is not a mask. It is the result of years of managing alone, of solving their own problems, of refusing to collapse under the weight. But strength, when it has no outlet, becomes suffering. Because they are also exhausted, bone-tired in a way that sleep does not fix, depleted in a way that rest does not restore. They wake up already behind, already carrying the weight of everything they must do, everyone they must support, every problem they must solve. And the list never ends. Because when you are the person who never asks, you become the person everyone assumes can handle more. And so more keeps coming. More responsibilities, more emotional labor, more crises to manage, more people leaning on them while they lean on nothing. And they accept it all, because to say no would mean admitting they have limits, and admitting limits would shatter the very identity they have spent years protecting. But beneath the surface, something is cracking. It shows up in small ways at first: the irritation that flares too quickly, the exhaustion that no amount of caffeine can touch, the moments when they snap at someone they love and immediately feel the shame of it, the nights when they lie awake replaying every interaction, wondering if they are failing, if they are enough, if they can keep this up. And then the shame compounds the exhaustion. Because they believe they should be able to handle this, that if they were truly strong, they would not be struggling, that needing help is evidence of some fundamental flaw, some personal inadequacy. And so they push harder. They try to fix themselves the same way they fix everything else, alone, through sheer force of will, without asking anyone for anything. But willpower has limits, and eventually they hit them. But even then, they do not ask. They simply adjust. They lower their expectations of joy. They accept exhaustion as a permanent state. They stop doing the things that once brought them pleasure because there is no time, no energy, no space for anything beyond survival. And here is where the war becomes unbearable. Because part of them knows this is not sustainable. Part of them sees the toll it is taking on their body, their relationships, their sense of self.
Part of them wants desperately to reach out, to admit struggle, to let someone else carry some of the weight. But the other part is terrified. Terrified that if they ask, they will be met with disappointment, that people will realize they are not as capable as they seemed, that their value was always tied to their usefulness, and without that, they are nothing. Terrified that needing makes them weak, that vulnerability makes them a burden, that the moment they stop being strong is the moment they stop being loved. And so they stay silent. They keep carrying what they carry. They keep smiling through the fracture. They keep saying, "I'm fine," as they feel themselves unraveling. And the internal conflict intensifies, the exhaustion growing louder, the fear growing stronger, the space between who they are and who they are pretending to be growing wider. And here is the cruelest part. They are not wrong to be afraid. Because sometimes when they have tried to be vulnerable, it has backfired. Someone dismissed their struggle as overreaction. Someone told them they were being dramatic. Someone used their moment of openness as ammunition later. And each of these experiences confirmed the original fear. Asking is dangerous. Needing is risky. Independence is the only safe option. But what they do not see is this. The cost of not asking is just as high. The cost is the slow erosion of their well-being, the gradual collapse of their capacity for joy, the quiet death of intimacy and their relationships because no one truly knows them, the loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people but still feeling utterly alone. And the war within them is not just about pride or fear, it is about identity.
It does not happen the way they imagined. There is no dramatic collapse, no public unraveling, no moment where they fall apart in front of everyone and are forced to admit they need help. For those who never ask, the breaking point is quieter than that. It is a whisper, not a scream, a slow unraveling, not a sudden crash. It happens in the ordinary moments. A Tuesday afternoon when they are doing something mundane, washing dishes, sitting in traffic, folding laundry, and suddenly, without warning, they feel it. The weight, the unbearable, suffocating weight of carrying everything alone. And for the first time, they are not sure they can keep going. Or it happens when someone asks if they are okay. A simple question, one they have answered 1,000 times with a reflexive, "I'm fine." But this time, something in them hesitates. The words catch in their throat. And in that pause, they feel the truth rising. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the quiet desperation they have been pushing down for so long. And they realize, if they say, "I'm fine," one more time, they will shatter. Or it happens in the middle of the night, lying awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on their chest. And they realize they cannot remember the last time they felt light, the last time they felt genuinely rested, the last time they allowed themselves to need something from someone. And in that moment, the truth becomes undeniable. This is not working. The independence they have clung to is not making them stronger. It is slowly destroying them. The walls they built are not protecting them. They are suffocating them. The strength they have relied on is running out, and they do not know what comes next. But here is what happens at the breaking point. The fear does not disappear. The terror of asking is still there. The shame of needing is still present. The belief that they will be too much, that they will burden others, that vulnerability will lead to rejection, all of it remains. But something else appears alongside it. Exhaustion. Not the physical kind, though that is there too, but a deeper exhaustion, a soul-level fatigue that makes the fear seem less important. Because they are too tired to keep fighting, too tired to keep pretending, too tired to maintain the facade for one more day. And in that exhaustion, a strange thing happens. The cost of asking becomes less than the cost of not asking. For so long, the equation was clear. Asking felt more dangerous than carrying everything alone. Vulnerability felt more terrifying than exhaustion. But at the breaking point, the math shifts.
because the pain of isolation, of managing alone, of never being seen, it becomes unbearable. And suddenly, the risk of asking feels smaller than the certainty of continuing as they are. This is not a choice made from strength. It is a choice made from necessity. They do not suddenly become brave. They do not overcome their fear. They simply reach a point where they have no other option. And so they do the thing they swore they would never do. They ask. Sometimes it is small. A text to a friend, "I'm not okay." 3 words that take an hour to type and another hour to send. Or a conversation with a partner where they finally admit, "I can't do this alone anymore." Or a moment in therapy where they stop deflecting and simply say, "I need help." And in that moment, everything changes. Not because the problem is solved, not because help arrives immediately, not because the fear magically disappears, but because they have done the thing they believed would destroy them, and they are still here. They asked, and the world did not end. The person they reached out to did not recoil in disgust. They were not met with judgment or dismissal. They were not told they were too much, too needy, too weak. Instead, they were met with something they did not expect: compassion. A friend who says, "I'm so glad you told me." A partner who says, "I've been waiting for you to let me in." A therapist who says, "This is not weakness, this is courage." And in hearing those words, something in them begins to soften. Because they realize the story they had been telling themselves was not true. Asking for help did not make them a burden, it made them human. Admitting struggle did not make them weak, it made them honest. Needing support did not push people away, it invited them closer. And this realization is both a relief and a grief.
Unlearning is slower than learning. The first time they ask for help, something shifts, but it does not stay shifted. The pattern is old, carved deep, reinforced by years of repetition. And so even after the breaking point, even after that first moment of reaching out, the instinct to retreat returns. They ask for help once and then immediately regret it. They open up and then spend the next 3 days wondering if they said too much. They let someone in and then panic that they have made a mistake, that they have exposed too much, that they will be seen as needy or weak or broken. And so they pull back. They reassure the person that they are fine now, that it was just a moment, that they do not actually need anything. They rebuild the walls faster than they came down. They return to managing alone because it feels safer, more familiar, more like themselves. This is the pattern trying to protect them. The old neural pathways lighting up, insisting that independence is survival, that asking was a mistake, that they must close the door they briefly opened. And in those moments, it feels like nothing has changed, like the breaking point was just a blip, a temporary weakness, not a turning point at all. But here is the truth. Healing is not linear. It is not a straight path from isolation to connection, from fear to trust, from independence to interdependence. It is a slow, messy, 2 steps forward, 1 step back process. And unlearning the belief that asking is dangerous takes time. More time than they wanted to. More time than feels fair. Because the belief is not just intellectual. It is woven into their nervous system, their sense of identity, their understanding of how the world works. And changing it requires more than just deciding to be different. It requires practice, repetition, proof. They have to ask again and again and again. They have to let people help them in small ways and notice that it does not destroy them. They have to be vulnerable and see that the feared rejection does not always come. They have to lean on someone and discover that they are not immediately abandoned. And each time they do this, something subtle shifts. The fear does not disappear, but it gets quieter.
The shame does not vanish, but it loosens its grip. The instinct to retreat does not go away, but it becomes less automatic. And slowly, very slowly, a new pattern begins to form. They start to notice the difference between asking and burdening. Before, these two things felt the same. Asking for help meant burdening someone. Needing support meant being too much. But now, with practice, they begin to see the distinction. Asking is simply communication. It is saying, I need something. And burdening is refusing to take no for an answer, demanding more than someone can give, using people without reciprocity. And most of the time, what they are doing is not burdening. It is just asking. They also begin to learn the language of reciprocity, because asking for help is not the same as becoming dependent. It is not about collapsing into someone else and letting them carry everything. It is about recognizing that relationships are meant to be reciprocal. Sometimes you give, sometimes you receive. Sometimes you are the strong one, sometimes you are the one who needs holding. And this reciprocity is what makes connections sustainable. It is not about never needing, it is about allowing the flow to move both ways. Giving when you can, receiving when you must. Trusting that the people who love you want to support you the same way you have supported them. But even with this understanding, the unlearning is difficult, because there are moments when they ask and are let down, when someone they reached out to does not respond the way they hoped, when vulnerability is met with discomfort or distance. And in those moments, the old story feels confirmed. See, asking is dangerous. People cannot be trusted. Independence is the only safe option. But here is where the growth happens. They learn to distinguish between one person's response and all people's responses. They learn that being let down by one person does not mean everyone will let them down. That one bad experience with vulnerability does not negate the possibility of connection. That some people are not equipped to hold what they are offering, and that is not a reflection of their worth. It is simply a mismatch of capacity.
There is a moment, somewhere in the unlearning, when they realize something has changed. It is not dramatic. There is no grand epiphany, no sudden transformation. But one day, they notice. They asked for help, and it did not feel like the end of the world. They reached out to a friend when they were struggling, and instead of shame, they felt relief. They admitted to their partner that they could not handle everything, and instead of rejection, they felt closer. They said, I need support, without the crushing fear that they were too much. And in that moment, they understand. Something fundamental has shifted. Not because they no longer value independence, not because they have become dependent or incapable, but because they have learned to hold both, the strength that comes from self-reliance and the strength that comes from connection. They have become interdependent. And interdependence is not a weakness. It is the most mature form of human connection. It is the recognition that we are both capable and in need, that we can give and receive, that we can hold others and be held. That strength is not about never needing, it is about knowing when to ask. This is the quiet revolution, not a loud declaration of change, not a complete abandonment of who they were, but a softening, a widening, an integration of the parts they kept separate for so long, the strong and the vulnerable, the capable and the needing, the giver and the receiver. And with this integration comes something unexpected. Peace, not the absence of struggle, not the end of hard days or difficult emotions, but a sense of no longer being at war with themselves, no longer fighting the internal battle between who they think they should be and who they actually are. They no longer see needing as failure. They no longer measure their worth by how little they ask. They no longer equate vulnerability with weakness. And in letting go of these beliefs, they discover something profound. They are still strong,
maybe even stronger, because strength that includes vulnerability is far more resilient than strength built on denial. They also discover that connection feels different now. Before, relationships were transactional. They gave, others received. They supported, others leaned. They were the rock, and everyone else was the one who needed holding. And while this felt safe, it also felt lonely, because true intimacy requires mutuality. It requires being seen in your struggle, not just your strength. But now they allow themselves to be seen. They let people witness their exhaustion, their fear, their moments of not having it all together. And instead of pushing people away, it brings them closer. Because people do not love the perfect version of us. They love the real one, the one who struggles and still shows up, the one who needs and still gives, the one who is human. And in being seen, they feel truly known, not just as the strong one, not just as the capable one, but as a whole person, complex, contradictory, imperfect, and worthy of love exactly as they are. This is the gift of letting go. They gain something far greater than what they release. They lose the facade, but they gain authenticity. They lose the armor, but they gain intimacy. They lose the illusion of invincibility, but they gain the reality of belonging. And belonging, it turns out, is what they were searching for all along. Not independence, not self-sufficiency, not the ability to need nothing from anyone, but the quiet assurance that they are part of something larger than themselves, that they are held even when they are struggling, that they are loved even when they are not strong. And this changes everything. It changes how they move through the world. They no longer walk alone, bracing against every challenge as if they are the only one who can handle it. They walk with others. They share the load. They ask when they need to and give when they can. It changes how they relate to themselves. They no longer see their needs as flaws to be hidden. They see them as information, as signals that they are human, that they are paying attention, that they are honoring what is true. It changes how they experience rest. Before, rest was stolen, brief moments of collapse between responsibilities. But now, rest is intentional. It is not something they have to earn. It is something they are allowed, something they need, something they give themselves without guilt. And it changes how they understand strength.